Yes, I have loved you with an everlasting love, an everlasting love, an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness have I drawn you, drawn you, drawn you.
Okay, we're going.
Hello, this is episode 28, and it's called Connecting with Jesus. And I am going to read a portion in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, and I'm going to read it out of the NLT version, since it says it a lot better than in the King James, to make sound more like the way we talk today, to help it be more understandable. Because like in the King James, instead of saying the gardener, it says my father's the husbandman. That's what they called the gardeners. And so I decided we better just talk the way we do talk now.
Yeah, because nobody's going to know what a husbandman is. That's going to have the whole meaning.
I mean, that's just weird, because a husband usually is a man anyway.
Usually, but...
And then a husbandman, it's like, well, what does that have to do with the vineyard?
Yeah, isn't that kind of redundant anyway?
Sort of.
Yeah, so we need modern language.
Okay, so this is in the NLT version. And it's starting with verse 1 of John 15. I am the true grapevine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit so they will produce even more. You have already been pruned and purified by the message I have given you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who remain in me, and I in them, will produce much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. So, the way this came to me the other day, sometimes I don't know what God's going to have us talk about at the end of the week. And yet, I was recognizing, like I'm very aware of lately especially, of my physical limitations, which caused me to feel very helpless. And I was recognizing that without God's help, each moment of the day, I need God's help just to get through my day. And so as I was praying, I just said to God, throughout the day as I was struggling to get up and do what I had to do and to use my hand and all that, I was saying, you know, God, I couldn't do anything without your help. And then that verse came to my mind. Without me, you can do nothing. And I started, and then the scripture started coming to me, and I thought, well, you know, how I'm feeling right now, I'm in the position in my life to where I can recognize how helpless I am and how much I need God's help. And so he wanted me to talk about that principle of it all. And then as I was thinking about it, I thought about, well, not only is he the vine and we're the branches and we can't do anything apart from him, it also talks about Jesus being the head of the church. And was thinking about how we can't function as a living organism as his body, the church, without being and staying connected with him. And so I was thinking about, when a person's beheaded, is their body able to function at all without the head? And of course the answer is no.
Nope.
The body is useless without the head to control and make it work. And so then I was thinking about the fact that must be why there's so many dead so-called churches. Because if they've forgotten that Jesus is supposed to be the head, and they're trying to be the head, the pastor's trying to be the head, the other leaders are trying to be the head, everybody's trying to make things happen the way they want it to. They're trying to run it like a business and not taking direction from God and, letting Jesus be in charge of his own body. It's the same as beheading him, which means we can't function as a body and the church dies. And the thing is, we all need God's help. But some people are more aware of it than others. When we're doing well and we're feeling well and we seem like we've got it all together and we're getting this done and that done, a lot of times we forget that we couldn't do any of it without God's help because we feel confident that we know what we're doing. We seem to have the strength to do it. We seem to be able to just do things. And then we plan our day and say, well, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. And we become less aware of how much we need God and how much we need his help. But then if we're in a situation in our life where we recognize, I can't solve my own problems. I can't fix what's going on right now. I feel helpless, like if we're sick or if we, have something else going on that we can't control. Then all of a sudden we start to realize, well, I guess I really need help from God. And yet we always do. And so this is one of those things that why it's easy, it's like a form of pride to think that we're doing everything in our life by ourselves without God's help. We don't realize how much we need him until we go through something where we realize, hey, I'm helpless to solve this. Or I'm helpless to do anything about it. I really need God. And we, then we're aware of it. But a lot of times we forget how much we need him the rest of the time. And so, and then when Chastity and I were talking about this, because I told her what I was thinking about for our podcast this week, we were talking about how you have to stay humble to do God's will. Mm-hmm. That really it comes down to humility. And so I started thinking about there's scriptures all throughout the Bible, and the one that really came to my mind is James 4:6, where it says, God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. And he tells us to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he might exalt you in due time. There's many scriptures where God reminds us, you've got to humble yourself, you've got to stay humble, you've got to stay connected to me, or you can't function. And you can't accomplish what you need to accomplish. And so that's something that we all need to remember, that we have to stay connected to Jesus and recognize he is the head of his church, his body. And remember, we've talked about the body of Christ. The church is not the building, but it's the family of God. It's Jesus' body doing his work on the earth. And yet he has to be the master. He has to be in charge. And none of us are supposed to exalt ourselves and try to be the boss or the head, or, just there's so much of that going on in this world. Self-appointed heads of the church that are not functioning and doing what God wants them to do because they're not connected any longer to Christ. And so that's why I thought about, that verse, without me you can do nothing. And so I went back, I knew where it was at, and that it was about where he said, I'm the vine and you're the branches, and then that part was on it. And so I went back to John 15 and reread that about how he describes himself as the vine. And we can't get our life or be able to bear fruit, like he says, unless we stay connected to the vine. Because we're the branches. We are not the vine itself, and if we don't stay in connection with Jesus the vine, we can't really accomplish anything that's of any worth. And so I just felt like we needed to talk about that today, and then just let God work and tell us what direction to go with all that. So, do you have any more thoughts about that?
Yeah. See, because we've been talking about how in churches it becomes whatever, the pastor or the priest say. They set themselves up as a self-appointed authority, where everybody has to go through them. Mm-hmm. But it's even worse than that, because they're also a slave to the government, and they have to make sure they're an approved religious organization or denomination that the government approves, so they'll remain their tax-exempt status.
Yeah.
And so it becomes very clear, if you follow the money, that it's a way for them to make money, and also for the government to regulate what is being taught. And part of the reason for that is, then that means if the government controls what is being taught in church, they can ensure that people vote according to the way that they want them to. It allows the political parties, the powers that be in government, to retain their power. So then they become the head. They become God instead of Jesus.
Right, that's what I was thinking when you said that.
Yeah.
But then the government tries to become the head of the church. So we're leaving Jesus way behind while people are trying to take over and have power over other people. And so many of them are maybe letting money be the head of the church. Well, let's make sure we take up a good offering, and we condemn people for not tithing so that they'll put more money in, and then we won't go bankrupt, and we won't have to close down this building. So, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people tend to do that. And they don't stay connected to Jesus, and we don't let him be the head of his own body, the church. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it could be the government, it could be money, it could be just pastors or other leaders who just like to control people and feel important and tell people what to do about everything in their lives, and act like they're the only ones that have a right to go to God for wisdom, but the rest of the people don't. They have to come through them. It's that same power thing that goes on all over the world, with dictators and countries. I mean, it's so far removed so much of the time from the way Jesus tried to set up his body, the church.
Well, and you can take plenty of examples of how power corrupts in modern governments as well as historically. Mm-hmm. Like, remember how the prophet Samuel warned the Israelites what would happen if they had a king? Because God didn't want them to have a king. They wanted to have a king like the other nations.
Yeah.
But God chose Saul, who at the time was humble. But then after he became king,
Yeah.
he got corrupt and he wanted to kill people, and he got crazy.
Well, see, and God was warning the people through Samuel
Mm-hmm.
that they shouldn't try to have a king, but they insisted. So
Yeah.
then he chose Saul at the time, because at that time he was very humble.
Yeah.
In fact, he was so shy that when they were about to announce him as king, he was hiding behind everybody in the crowd. He was that shy about it. And then he flipped the other way after he gotten that power and just started thinking, yeah, I want to be in control. So yeah, he completely flipped the other way, didn't he?
Well, yeah. Again, here's what was strange about it too. Like, here's when King Saul really started to fall apart. Is when they faced the giant Goliath. You know, the Philistine army, and there was the giant Goliath. And King Saul was too afraid to even fight the giant. But then, by that time, God had already anointed David, the shepherd, to be the next king.
Yeah,
And-
because already Saul was being rebellious.
Yeah, he was already,
Yeah.
and he wasn't obeying the orders that got given him through Samuel and everything. Anyway, but here's the thing. So then this poor shepherd dude, David, he is willing to fight Goliath, and then it was interesting how the story, because I remember this story. It's a very famous story. Everyone's heard it, even if they haven't read the Bible. So Saul tries to give David, his armor, but the thing is, Saul wasn't wearing. He wasn't going to go fight. But he was the king. He was in charge.
And it didn't fit David, so
Right.
he didn't want to wear it.
Yeah, and so, but the thing is, here's what human leaders do: they send other people to die instead of them.
Yeah.
And here's the difference between a human king, a human head, and Jesus, is that a king will send soldiers and shepherd boys to go die, and so that they don't die. Whereas Jesus dies for us so that we don't have to die. And that's the difference between having Christ as the head and having a human king or a president or a pastor or a priest.
Yeah. And Saul did get into pride later, and he got jealous because everybody was pleased with David, and after he let David be the one to kill Goliath, and everybody was so relieved because they defeated the Philistines who were trying to kill them. And so then he got worse and worse, because then he got jealous. He wanted to be the most important one.
Yep. So then he was trying to kill David.
So then he starts trying to kill David. So he really went downhill.
But then here's where it gets even more interesting, is that later on, David really messed up. Because after he became the king, he had a lot of power and he could do anything he wanted. So most people know the story about what happened with Bathsheba. Is that he has an affair with Bathsheba, which was Uriah's wife. So he sends Uriah to go get killed in war so he can take Uriah's wife Bathsheba.
Right.
And the point is that once somebody becomes king, and once everybody obeys them and does what they want, they get this idea, hey, look at me, I'm great. I just have unlimited power. I can do whatever I want.
Right.
And then they lose their morality. They lose any standards of behavior.
But the big difference between Saul and David is David actually did repent.
Yeah, he did. Whereas Saul
didn't.
Yeah, Saul never really did. And then,
But you're right.
Yeah.
David probably never would have got to that point.
Mm-hmm.
Except he was thinking he was beyond what everybody else was required to do, because instead of going into that battle himself, usually the kings led him. But he just let them all go in, and while they're in battle, he's at home at the palace, and he has time to look out the window and notice some beautiful woman bathing.
Exactly.
And so by just not taking any responsibility and then trying to cover up his sin when Bathsheba got pregnant with his child and he couldn't pass it off as Uriah's child, then he has Uriah killed. And of course, he realized later what a terrible sin he had committed, but he did go back to God. But it was something that wouldn't have happened if he hadn't got cocky about it, thinking, I can just do what I want now.
And also, he didn't repent until after he got called out on it by Nathan the prophet.
Yes.
Because Nathan the prophet told him that whole story about, like, this man who had 100 sheep, then he slaughtered his neighbor's sheep instead. That was like his friend, his pet, and killed that sheep instead of one of his own. Not that anybody should be killing sheep to begin with, but the point is, and see, the thing is, though, David was making the exact same mistake that Saul did, because he wasn't taking responsibility. He was sending other people to die in war for him, and he was messing around with Bathsheba, and then he had many children who because he had multiple wives, I'm pretty sure already. And then they were all fighting who was going to be the next king. So it became this whole family feud over whatever.
There ended up being consequences. Mm-hmm. Even though he repented and God forgave him, it ended up bringing all kinds of disaster on his whole family. And so he went through a lot of sorrow, and that he reaped what he sowed. The only thing is, you're right, he had to get called on it, but then after he got confronted, he definitely repented. And that's the only difference between what he did and what Saul did that made a difference.
And then what's interesting about it is how when Solomon, who interestingly was the second son that David and Bathsheba had together, became the next king, he started out okay too, because he asked God for wisdom of how to lead the people. He wasn't prideful at the beginning,
right?
But then he ended up making a lot of mistakes too, because
once he got in that position, he didn't stay humble, and he started trying to obtain everything he could for himself, including all the women he could. And in many ways, even though God gave him all that wisdom, and he had it for a while, he became very foolish. Because he tried to disconnect himself from God.
Yeah.
And not go by God's direction, but just kind of started thinking, well, I'm king. Let me see what I can do for myself.
Right. See, this is why people say power corrupts, because it turns people who start out humble, they start out on the right track, but then they get this idea, I have enough money, I can buy anything I want, I can even get out of it. If I commit crimes, I can just pay enough money and get away with it, to lawyers and whatever. And so people get this idea, even in modern times, like politicians, for example. Some of them, I believe, start out good, like when they're running for office, and they say their goals, and some of them might even intend to keep some of the promises that they do. Yeah. But then after they start getting that salary, once they have all this power and they can do all these things, then they start thinking, well, maybe I'll do this, and they quit caring about the ideals that they stood for to begin with.
Yeah. And they really get deceived, because I've often wondered sometimes about these world leaders that are dictators and ruthless in the way they're treating people, and then they're getting older and older. It's almost like they forget that they're going to die, and that eventually they're going to have to answer for everything they've done. They think they can get away with it, and they separate their mind from the reality that we're all eventually going to die, and what we do in our life will make a difference, and that we are going to be judged for what we do. It's going to cause things that we don't really want to happen, but we deceive ourselves into thinking that we'll just get whatever we want, and we'll always have what we want, and we can just have more and more and more and more. And people forget that they're mortal, and they just keep trying to do whatever they want, and they're out of touch with reality when they start just grabbing for whatever they want in life, and they forget to be accountable to God, and they don't even recognize sometimes that they ever needed God. They just think they were born to have their own way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very sad, but that goes into the whole thing about how if Jesus is no longer the head, then somebody much, much worse comes along.
Yes.
That becomes the new religion then.
Yeah. And there's a lot of that going on, and we've talked about this before. That's why there have been so many divisions. And people breaking up into different denominations, everybody wanting their own way about every little thing, because they're no longer really trying to serve God. They're no longer letting Jesus be the head of his church. It's all about, well, I'm the head, and I'm more important than you, and I know more than you. And they, like these pastors, they go to like a seminary or a Bible college, and so they think they're just paid professionals just doing their job, and they are thinking of it as a business, and that they should just get paid for what they do, and they'll put on a show of some sort to make it appealing to the congregation, so they'll want to keep coming, and they want to keep putting money into that church, and everybody gets off focus from what the church even is supposed to be. And I don't think it's ever meant to be run like a business. I know the early church wasn't run like a business, and even when they did take up offerings in the New Testament, it was usually for a specific purpose that they all agreed upon, which was usually to take it to help poor people.
Mm-hmm.
Like at one point it talks about they were collecting an offering to go help the people in Jerusalem who were the Christians there that were poor and needed help. And whenever somebody needed help, they all tried to get together and provide for that need. It wasn't about, well, the pastor needs to get paid. And in fact, Paul made sure that he, even though there are some scriptures that have to do with helping to take care of and support the preachers that came and visited, they would give them hospitality and help them sometimes. That's why he said, I don't want you to think that you're obligated to pay me. That's why I earn my own living. And I'm a tent maker, and I keep doing that so that you don't feel obligated to support me.
Mm-hmm.
And he was an itinerant preacher where he went all over the place planting churches. And even though there are certain scriptures that talk about, appointing elders and all that stuff, the context of all of it is that these people, God raises them up within a church body because they begin to function in the type of gifts that serves everybody there. It's not a random thing. Well, I like the way this person looks. Let's make him an elder.
Yeah. Well, okay. Let's just look at the way things were in Jesus' day compared to modern times.
Mm-hmm.
Take, for example, people would travel out into the middle of nowhere to hear Jesus speak, even outside of towns. And they did not have church buildings with air conditionings and padded pews to sit in and a musical show at the beginning. And they had to sit in the grass and dirt and mud. And it's like, the thing is, people back then, they were so eager to hear what Jesus had to say that they would follow him. He couldn't even get away from him and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But now it's like people have all these church buildings and they've got to have everything comfortable. They've got to have everything their way, and they've got to dress fancy. Whereas it's no longer Jesus teaching people in rags sitting in the grass anymore. And so back then it was clear that it was about Jesus and his teaching. And now it's all about, it's about the building, and we have to pay the electric bill and the water bill and repair everything. It becomes about maintaining the building, and people think that's the church. They call it the church. And so if something happens to the church building, they call it the church. And it became, instead of being about the people who are the church, instead of being about Christ, it's all about, it's the building, and, it's just...
We got to have some money to take care of our building.
Right.
And then what about the people who need our help?
Mm-hmm.
But, they don't matter because they're not a part of our church. In fact, I was reminded, I had heard this before, but I was reminded of the fact that in some churches, people actually buy the pew they want to sit in. And so if a newcomer comes and sits in their pew, they said, "This is my seat. I bought it. I come and sit here every time I come. And what are you doing in my seat? I paid for this." They actually pay to have their own pew or their own chair so that they have a spot that's theirs. And they get mad sometimes if a visitor happens to be sitting in their seat that they paid for. Well, what in the world is that all about?
That's very Sheldon Cooper. They got to have their spot.
Well, yeah, but see, I'm glad, a lot of denominations don't do that, but there are many churches who have that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, why do you care that much about sitting in a certain place that you're willing to put down money to keep your spot, and then instead of caring about this person who's coming to church, to your church building, to try to seek God, you just tell them to get out of your seat? I mean, that isn't Jesus' attitude, and that isn't his heart, and so we're not following his direction.
Yeah. It's sort of like people think, just like people think the church is what Christianity is about, they think the building is what it's about.
Yeah.
They think the physical structure is what it is. Well, there's two analogies I have in mind that relate to this. So, if you think that a person is their physical body, you think that that's actually the person, then when the person dies and they're no longer there, you're still worshiping their body and putting it in this casket, or you put it in an urn and you carry their ashes with you the rest of your life, because they think that body is that person.
Yeah.
And that's what they're doing. They're taking the physical structure that houses the person, or the physical structure of the church building that houses the people, which are supposed to be the church. They're taking the physical structure and mistaking that for the spiritual thing. It's just like if somebody thinks that a computer is all about hardware, but not the software that runs on it, because it's just a hunk of metal and plastic. If it's just the hardware, if it doesn't have an operating system or software written to run on it. And that's what people are mistaking. They're mistaking the spiritual thing with the physical thing. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't get anything out of bowing down and worshiping my computer if it wasn't working for me.
Right.
So I could use it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know. I don't know why we want to behead Christ from his body. So, do you think we've made our point today?
I think we did.
Anything else come to your mind that needs to be...
I don't know. Was there anything else?
I was thinking while you were talking about that, about the building, I've been in places where I liked the building being simple like it was. Because then I did feel more like I was just in a family.
Mm-hmm.
But then I would hear people say, particularly the pastor would say, I want this building to look more churchy, whatever that means, and want to have stained glass windows. And they even made a comment this one time. I think eventually, see, it didn't have a steeple, and you know how people think they have to have a steeple.
Yep.
Well, he even said, I want us to have 12 steeples, one for each of the apostles. Now, I thought that was pretty ludicrous.
Yeah. It it's crazy because first of all mistaking the building as being the church and being all focused on the physical structure, having steeples and stained glass windows. You know, I have to say, this is kind of like how people get obsessed with the human body and what they think a man or woman is based on body parts. It's a lot like that. Oh, it has to have a steeple, it has to have stained glass windows, it has to have pews, and they have this idea. Oh, well, this is what a man or woman is based on whether they have these parts or not, and that has never been what it's about.
Or how they do their hair.
Yeah. The church is not about the building and what the architecture of that building is. And being a man or woman is not about the physical body either. It's about the soul, the spirit, the personality, what it is to them that they think makes a man or woman, you know? And so people are mistaking the spiritual for the physical, thinking the physical body is what it's about.
Yeah, or their unique function in the world is what it's about rather than what their body looks like or anything else.
So basically they're just missing the entire point. Like, they've been so distracted from the original purpose.
So anyway, but that came to my mind about people wanting being obsessed with the building and how it looks.
Yeah.
And then treating the people just terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if anybody could possibly think that pleases God or reflects His purpose for His body, the church. But it shows really how ludicrous it gets when people separate themselves from Jesus and don't stay connected. So that we should be always getting our orders from the head to know how to live, and we need to know how much we need to stay attached to Jesus, that without Him we can do nothing. Anything we do isn't going to accomplish a thing, and we're not going to bear any fruit. Now, I know you've talked before about what it means to bear fruit. Because we were reading that, and some people say, well, that's, soul winning. Bearing fruit is bringing people into the kingdom. Well, that's true, but also, what about the fruit of the Spirit?
Yeah.
We're not going to be loving and caring if we don't stay connected to Jesus, because by ourselves, we don't really know how to be that loving. Jesus is that way, and He teaches us how.
Yeah, and Jesus is kind of unique in that way, because a lot of other belief systems, they don't really have that kind of self-sacrificial love that Jesus taught, and loving even your enemies and that kind of thing.
And they do exalt themselves a lot.
Yep. Another thing that people do is they put the Bible as the head instead of Jesus. Now, here's the thing, is that the Bible is one great source of information because that's where you can read the stories of Jesus. But that's only the ones that were written down. And even still, we don't know what was all translated correctly and all that, too. And there's interpretation. But here's the thing: is to connect with Jesus, you have to know the character of Jesus and what Jesus would or would not do. Because there's the phrase, "What would Jesus do?" Mm-hmm. And when you think about what would Jesus do, and you think about that while you're reading the Old Testament, and then God's commanding the Israelites to go, kill everyone in this nation, but you can keep the women to have sex with. Is that what Jesus would do? I know the Old Testament says that God says that, but is that what Jesus would do? Would Jesus ever do that? And did Jesus ever once command violence?
See, that's why we question some of the things that were written in the Old Testament, because they don't line up with the full revelation of Jesus. And there are reasons why the people that wrote those things down thought those were the things God wanted them to do, because all the other nations around did similar things, and they thought their gods told them to do it, so our God must be telling us to do the same thing. There was a lot of ignorance, and it took a long time for people to begin to understand what God's will really was. And like I shared in that overview of the Bible, we don't see a true revelation of what God's like until we get to the New Testament and Jesus begins to show us what He's like, which is really a manifestation of what God is like. Mm-hmm. So that's true. That's another thing that we're going to have to cover more about, why so many things are written in the Old Testament that don't seem to match what goes on in the New Testament.
Yeah.
There's some value in it, but we need to be discerning and learn why those things were written down the way they were. Because these people, they were human beings, and sometimes they were enlightened by God, and the Holy Spirit was able to communicate certain truths through them. Mm-hmm. But then they also had their own perspective, because they didn't have a full revelation of everything that God wanted them to understand yet. And it took a progression of time for that revelation to get clearer and clearer and clearer. And so that's why that's true. If you see the way Jesus is in the New Testament, that's why some people believe that, some of the early Christian churches that kind of were considered heretical, and weren't accepted, was because some of them got the idea, there's two different gods, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, because he seemed so different. Yeah. But that's because of the misunderstanding of why God was painted the way he was, picture of him in the Old Testament, and then how it progressed to deeper understanding after Jesus came and showed what God was really like and explained things better. So that's true. That's why people can get stuck in that. And then they think we're all supposed to act that way.
Yeah.
And just take what we want and, God told me I could.
And see, there's a lot. There's a lot of things in the Old Testament that modern Christians don't follow today.
Yeah.
For example, a lot of them are eating pork, which I don't recommend. Obviously, I'm a vegan, but but the thing is.
But then there's other things they'll say. See what it says.
Yeah.
It says homosexuals are bad.
I know. In fact,
But forget everything else.
In fact, speaking of which, I'm glad you brought that up, because I recently was having a little comment back and forth with someone on Instagram, and I was explaining that, look, the reason they wrote that stuff about homosexuality in the Old Testament is because they were straight people and they didn't understand gay people, so they wrote their own homophobia into the Bible. And they said I was desecrating Scripture for pointing out that humans wrote the Bible. They were writing the Old Testament, and when they wrote that in Leviticus, if a man lays with a man as a man lays with a woman, then the two shall be put to death. What? But here's the thing: they were not thinking this through, because how does a man lay with a man as a man lays with a woman? What does that even mean?
course, you wouldn't know since you're asexual.
I know. I don't even know. But the thing is, it was not clear, based on what that verse is saying. It's not even clear what it means. And maybe they understood at the time what they were trying to say. But you know how when I write a book and you're proofreading it, and there's a paragraph, and you read what I said in that paragraph, and you don't know what I was trying to say, and you make me rewrite it. Some of those verses and chapters in the Bible are like that, where it's not
and
clear
then
what.
we go back to translations. Too.
Yes, it was probably incorrectly translated
Some
too.
translations are faulty too, and then people just say, "Well, that's the Bible. Bible says it right here."
Yeah.
But which translation, and what's the context of it? What was God trying to point out in that whole passage? But no, let's just lift one verse out and condemn people with it. Just like we talked about before, people that were, putting a tattoo on themselves with that verse about, not to have a man lie with a man, and condemning it and wearing a tattoo. And then you go further on in that same passage and it says it's an abomination to have tattoos.
Yeah.
So see, it's picking and choosing what you want to harp about rather than looking at the whole picture, trying to understand it, trying to look at the whole revelation of God that He gave us in the Bible, and learning to understand and learning to ask questions until you find answers. Don't just assume things just at face value and looking at this verse or that verse, or listen to a preacher who just preaches the same verse every time they talk, and just say, well, what it says there, and then forget about the rest of it.
Yeah, and so people are picking and choosing which verses they follow.
Yeah.
And yet, as long as we think about the character of Jesus, and here's my approach to it, is that there's a lot even in the New Testament that doesn't make sense to me. But if you read the four Gospels, which most of the stories are pretty consistent, and you look at the things Jesus taught, you start to see a common theme about teaching love, and how to treat people, and like the teaching. So you see a common thread. You can get enough from what's in there to know that Jesus would not be doing the things in the Old Testament,
Yeah.
So that's the thing.
So you're basically saying, what would Jesus do?
Yeah.
That's something, if we know anything about Jesus, and if we don't, we better study the New Testament. But if we do, just say, well, would Jesus do that? Before our churches start acting like we're just going to do whatever we want because we're the boss.
Yeah, and what people will do is they will literally worship anything else other than Jesus.
Yeah.
Like whether it's a pastor or a priest or the church building or the Bible, and if all else fails, they will form a calf out of gold and worship that. So
another thought came to my mind, and this had actually come to my mind earlier today, which I think I'll throw in there before we close this out. Sometimes the pastor thinks he's entitled to call the shots. And there was a pastor who was just basically dictating a lot of things, and I confronted him and I said, well, you're not God. He says, but I'm God's representative. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. The Bible teaches us that all of us in His body are His representatives together. Not just Him. He got the idea, well, I'm a pastor, so I'm God's representative, so what I say goes. So basically he was still trying to be God and not letting the whole body of Christ manifest Jesus together. It was the leader who pretty much thought he was God, but when I confronted him, he says, no, but I'm God's representative, so basically what I say goes.
Yeah.
So that's another way people can get hung up. Well, I'm God's representative, and they'll quote verses like there's verses in the Old Testament that says, touch not my anointed and do my servants no harm, which was talking about like the anointed kings or prophets and stuff like that in the Old Testament. And I've heard people quote that to say, don't challenge the pastor because he's anointed of God. Don't criticize him. Don't tell him he's doing anything wrong. Touch not mine anointed. Do my servant no harm. Like he's the only one that's trying to serve God.
Yeah.
And they quote that verse. They say, well, don't criticize your pastor because he's anointed. And man, anything can be used as an excuse.
Well, and also let's be reminded that these authority that these people have as pastors of churches, there's like church boards and there's seminary, and it's all humans all the way up deciding who is allowed to become a pastor. And as soon as a pastor says, you know what, gay and transgender people are people too, let's love them like Jesus would have loved them, they fire them from being a pastor, as you know.
Yeah, they do.
So, ironically, as soon as a pastor starts following Jesus instead of what the powers politically are, then he gets fired from being a pastor.
Yeah.
And that's why there's so few good pastors, because all the good ones get fired.
But also, it's all set up wrong anyway, just like we've talked before. The body of Christ is not supposed to be one person up at the front dictating everything.
Mm-hmm.
God wants to work through his whole body. He wants us to be a family, caring for one another. He wants everybody involved in using their gifts. No one dominating anybody else, but everybody being a servant to one another. And we're trying to teach like a new model of how it's supposed to be, because I think people have totally forgotten with all that's gone on in history with the churches that is still going on and all the fighting and competition. There's just so much wrong. And so that's just it. Recognizing how much we need to be connected with Jesus will help us get back to the way Jesus originally planned for his body to function. So those are just some examples of some of the things that can go wrong when we do forget and we disconnect ourselves, from Jesus, and we don't rely on him and recognize that he should be in control and that we need to stay humble, let God have his way, nobody acting like they have to have their way and have to fight over who's the boss. None of that should be happening among God's people. So I felt like that was the message we were supposed to give, that we all need to acknowledge that without him we can do nothing. So is that a good ending?
Yep. I think we said it all.
Okay. Thank you, people.
And thanks for listening.
Yes, I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have loved you. I have drawn you. Yes.